Good morning. My name is Alexander Burgansky. I'm head of oil and gas research at Renaissance Capital, and it gives me a great pleasure to welcome everybody to the second day of Renaissance Capital's 25th annual Russia conference, and specifically to today's panel discussion, Response to Climate Change. We're very fortunate to have a distinguished panel of participants to discuss the topic of climate change, which is becoming increasingly relevant for countries, companies, and investors across emerging and frontier markets. Without further delays, I would like to introduce our today's speakers. Gyetvay, Deputy Chairman of the Management Board at NOVATEK, Brien, Managing Director for Economics and Finance at SIBUR, Svetlana Ivchenko, Director of Sustainable Development at Norilsk, Tatiana Mitrova, Professor, Head of Research at SKOLKOVO Energy Center, and Mikhail Shamolin, President, Chairman of the Board, Segezha Group. Welcome to our panel. Russia's efforts on combating the effects of climate change are governed by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that was adopted in 1992 and ratified by Russia in 1994. The first global initiative under this convention was the Kyoto Protocol, which was signed in 1997. This was replaced by the Paris Agreement in 2015. In accordance with the Paris Agreement, all participating countries have to set their own ambitious objectives with regard to climate change, including setting their own emission reduction targets for 2050. Most corporates have to do the same under various climate-related protocols and disclosure rules. While Russia has published its draft long-term strategy last year, it was supposed to be formally adopted by the end of 2020, but this is yet to happen. My first question is then to Tatiana Mitrova. What is the current status of Russia's national climate targets? When will the national strategy be adopted? And how do Russia's national climate targets compare to other countries?
Thank you, Alexander, and hello, everybody. Actually, in Russia, greenhouse gas emissions regulation is still in the very initial stage. And it is expected that in 2021, this year, the first regulatory documents will come into force. You've mentioned already the long-term goal of the Russian Federation on greenhouse gas emissions. That was actually approved already by the presidential decree number 666 in November 2020. And it sets the target of emissions of 70% from the level of 1990 to be achieved by 2030. Actually, it doesn't look as a really ambitious target because in 2017, Russian emissions, they were about 50.7% of the level of 1990. So basically, we are talking about the official target to increase emissions during this decade. It is fixed in this presidential decree, and this is official Russia's NDC submitted in the framework of the Paris Agreement by the end of the last year. Then there is this strategy of long-term development of the Russian Federation with low greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. The draft regulation was already published. I think it was August last year. It has been severely criticized by the ministries, and now it is again reviewed. Hopefully, we expect it to be finalized before Glasgow, so sometime during the summer or in the fall. Both these documents, the presidential decree and the long-term strategy, they are actually not very ambitious, as I said. So the target is quite moderate. And the very regulation, there is no carbon price or carbon tax. There are no real restrictions on carbon emissions. It's more about accounting and information disclosure at this stage, which is already, by the way, a big step ahead, because preliminary we didn't have any disclosure or any regulation on all greenhouse gas emissions. So there was only a partial regulation on methane emissions. And then there is another document which is also about disclosure and about reporting. It was actually approved by the State Duma last week on June 15 in the third reading. It is federal law on limiting greenhouse gas emissions. So it conceptually corresponds to the presidential Again, no regulation is introduced as such. It is rather the framework for reporting and for a disclosure of the information. So this is the status quo, better than nothing, but still very far away from the real greenhouse gas regulation.
Thank you for that. We'll come back to the issue of regulation a bit later. But as we just heard, Russia's national carbon reduction targets are not as ambitious as some of the other countries. Russian corporates, on the other hand, tend to show better performance on climate metrics compared to the international peers and have equally ambitious, or in some cases even more ambitious targets. And I would like to ask our speakers to share the key elements of their climate strategies, and if possible, also discuss them in the context of their international peer group. Can we start with NOVATEK? Mark, please.
First, I would like to state that I do believe that Russia is doing something about climate change and has taken a proactive stance as the country adopted the tenets of the Paris Climate Agreement in September 2019. Like the Kyoto Protocol in '97 and the Paris Agreement in 2015, setting unenforceable individual climate targets was never going to succeed with the various states of economic development and the concessions made to certain polluting countries. If we can start with the fundamental premise that this represents a global challenge, then we can see some hopeful prospects of an energy transition, but to assume that decarbonizing society without the use of fossil fuels, particularly natural gas, is unrealistic. We have stated many times already that our pathway to decarbonizing society is through natural gas, as we don't characterize natural gas as a transition fuel, as we talked about yesterday, but more like a bridge fuel, or, not as a bridge fuel, but more as an integral part of the future energy mix for many, many decades. We need to bring forth this debate on how best to decarbonize society in a responsible manner, rather than publishing worst case scenarios or promulgating fear-mongering narratives. And I believe the recent IEA net zero emissions 2050 roadmap was heralded by the media and various green NGOs as a wake-up call to society, but instead, I believe it raised more uncertainties as to future oil and gas investments beyond 2021 and navigated a major shift towards mostly renewables. This proposition, in our opinion, is totally unrealistic and lacks any credibility. At NOVATEK, we published our environmental and climate change targets this past August, established in 2019 as our baseline year, and including our climate metrics through our strategy period of 2030. We felt that this period represented a realistic time frame considering our present corporate strategy, and we can be held accountable in shorter time periods rather than setting aspirational goals, like for example, to 2050 with no accountability. The other thing I'd like to mention too is sustainability is not a new concept at NOVATEK. Interestingly, we included decarbonization and climate change in our recent strategy that we published in 2017, as sustainable development is an integral part of our overall strategic framework, and development of increasing our natural gas output, both domestically and internationally, contributes to the replacement of dirtier fuels like coal in the energy mix. In 2008, we started reporting under the carbon disclosure requirements, and in 2020, we joined the methane guiding principles as a signatory member. And in July of this upcoming month, we will publish our 14th sustainability report, which makes NOVATEK the longest history of sustainable reporting in the Russian oil and gas industry, which will be fully compliant with GRI and SASB standards, as well as TCFD recommendations. How do we fare against our global peers? I would say unequivocally, very favorably. Our gas mix and our production reserves profile is more than 85%. We have one of the lowest GHG emissions globally at 298 kilograms per carbon emissions per BOE versus the industry average of 352 kilograms of carbon. Our Yamal LNG project ranks second globally at 0.26 ton carbon per ton of emissions intensity versus the industry average of about 0.4. Ironically, Alexander, many of the climate targets that we have outlined recently are already lower than the climate reduction targets established by our international peers to 2035 or 2040. We're also confident that we can further reduce our carbon footprint by implementing new technologies such as CCS, using blended fuels like hydrogen, natural gas mix to run our turbines and compressors, and introducing green energy into the power source at our facilities. You know, we know that producing approximately 18.8 million tons of LNG this past year, we effectively reduced 52 million tons of coal by the coal to gas switch-in, and by 2030, we believe that producing an average of 62 million tons per annum, we can produce more than 170 million tons of carbon annually for many years. So this represents our contributions to decarbonizing, and the main reason why we advocate strongly, natural gas, because it's affordable, secure, and sustainable.
Thank you very much, Mark. Peter, can I ask you to comment on SIBUR's climate strategy, please? Peter, I think you are muted.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Alex. And first, to take on your comment with respect to how we look versus peers, and I appreciate that not everybody on the phone will have had access to SIBUR financial reporting information, as we only currently have public debt. But in short, we look very good versus our global petrochemical peers in terms of emission levels per EBITDA, and that's without getting any credit, if you will, for the reduction of natural gas flaring in West Siberia, which our business makes possible, the reduction of flaring. In terms of the key components of our climate strategy, I would list 5. The first being, and the most current, if you will, reduction of emissions at our existing production facilities. We're doing that through a combination of newer and more technologically advanced capacities that we've installed, investing in related infrastructure for water, waste, and other treatments, and also just better and more active monitoring and management of emissions through increased digitalization and operating systems. Secondly, we're growing the share of renewable energy sources at our facilities, especially at our newer projects. For example, at the planned Amur gas chemical complex in the Far East in the Amur Oblast, we're looking at both hydro and solar supply to that facility. We're also already established a solar capacity at our facility in southern Russia at SIBUR Yug. Third component that we highlight is we're supporting and also participating in projects in Russia to increase the natural capture of carbon. We've already announced 2 specific projects, one in Tyumen, one in Voronezh. They're both forestation-related projects to develop the capability to monitor and measure consumption capacity of different trees and plants, and provide a framework, if you will, for planning and valuing such forestation projects going forward, and regulating as well. Next, I would mention industrial level carbon capture technology. This is at an earlier stage, admittedly, but we are discussing with a number of potential partners, developing and eventually rolling out industrial scale carbon capture facilities. And then lastly, and I understand we'll come back to this later, Alexander, so I won't spend much time on it, is our recycling. If we're talking broadly about climate, we're obviously going to be talking about recycling, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. Just want to highlight that all of these initiatives are coming out of SIBUR's ESG strategy, which is underpinned by a strong culture around ESG at SIBUR for at least 5 to 7 years. For example, if you take a look at just one of our HSE indicators, which HSE indicators form over a quarter of senior management incentive compensation, and just take LTIF, we managed to reduce that by 2/3 over the past 5 years. And I think that's a good indicator of how systematic, if you will, SIBUR is committed to these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, and we will come back to some of these issues later in this discussion. So can I ask Svetlana, please, to talk about the climate strategy for Norilsk nickel?
Yeah, thank you for this opportunity. Norilsk is committed to being a responsible supplier for the green economy, making every effort to continue reducing its carbon footprint. Norilsk's climate change strategy was announced last December as a concept with key statements, and lately we developed it, and our strategy was recently approved by the board. It was just in June, 1st of June. So we aim at two main goals. First is to maintain Scope 2 and Scope 1 and Scope 2 absolute GHG emissions under the GHG protocol, not higher than 10 million tons of CO2 equivalent. And this goal is despite 30-40 increase in metal production we expect by 2020 compared to 2017. And the second one is to remain in the bottom quartile of the global Scope 1 and Scope 2 GHG emission intensity curve for the global nickel industry, measured in GHG emissions per ton of nickel equivalent. So furthermore, our climate change policy, due to be released soon, stipulates on key principles to respect the Paris Agreement and supporting global efforts of combating climate change. We aim to deliver on these tasks through increasing energy efficiency, exploring opportunity for renewables in our energy supply, switching to low carbon or alternative fuels, and developing partnership to support innovations. Details of the program is now under development, and as you asked to compare with our peer groups, based on year 2020 results, our relative competitive position is strong. Our Scope 2 and Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are one of the lowest absolute greenhouse gases level among our mining majors globally. And as for electricity, so 46% of our electricity is generated from renewable sources. It's also a relatively high level on a global scale. So given that, Norilsk strives to find right balance between production growth essential to boost green energy and our own decarbonization strategy, finally to ensure reliability of our operation, because our metals support to increase demand for green economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Svetlana. I think green energy generation could also be an important part of Segezha Group's climate strategy. So Mikhail, can you please talk to us about the climate strategy for your group?
Yeah, a couple of things. The biggest question which is yet to be answered right now is how the forests which we manage and operate, and we manage and operate them on the basis of 49-year leases from the government. So how those forests will be treated from the calculation of CO2 unit perspective. If those forests will be treated the way we believe they will be treated as a resource that we operate and manage, then we will have a positive balance of about 500,000 CO2 units at our disposal. So not only we will not have an issue of CO2 emission, but we will be able to trade those units with other companies and businesses that actually are CO2 negative and need to be compensated for the carbon tax. And we estimate that we can increase our EBITDA by about 5 billion rubles just doing so. And two things how we can kind of further enhance the carbon reduction agenda. One, which I think is the biggest, is advancing the use of wood in modern multi-story house construction. Currently, about 39% of all the CO2 emissions globally come from buildings, constructing buildings and using buildings. And from using buildings, it's about 28%, all the heat and everything involved in having people live there. And about 11% are basically CO2 emissions that go with the construction process, and mainly manufacturing concrete and cement from which concrete is made. So cement is the prime material used in multi-story construction these days. It has been proven a few years back that concrete can be replaced with a technology called CLT, or cross-laminated timber, is where large parts of building are manufactured and glued from wood. And there are examples already in Europe, Scandinavia, Australia, where buildings up to 28 stories are built from CLT. So our mission is to advance this agenda in Russia and in Europe predominantly, and try to kind of drive the construction industry towards using more and more wood as a construction material instead of concrete, that will naturally reduce the CO2 emissions generated while producing cement, and also given that wood is a renewable resource, and wood in the building continues to absorb CO2 even when it's dead wood, we get benefits from basically all sides. And besides kind of changing the construction tradition, so to say, there are no physical or technological limitations to wood being used in construction, and we are big believers that can be the case. We are the first CLT producer in Russia, and we're investing a lot in this technology. And second direction which we are taking in Russia is, together with the government, by the way, which is supporting this idea, is to use a lot of the former agricultural land in Russia that is not being used for agricultural purposes now, and turning it into a land where the forests can be harvested for use in the forestry and pulp paper industry. Essentially, in the Soviet Union, it used to be that you would have a lot of agricultural land in the middle of Russia, in the European part, also in the northern part, also in Siberia. And nowadays, producing wheat in those areas makes no economic sense because of the cost. And most of the wheat production is concentrated now in the south, in Krasnodar and the Rostov region. But those huge plots of land, which on paper are agricultural land, and the government is trying to enforce the owners to either turn it back to agriculture or pay fines. They cannot do that simply because economically it doesn't work. And in the last 40 years after the breakup of the Soviet Union, this agricultural land is actually covered by forest, in fact. So what we're doing, we're buying this agricultural land from the government, and we're turning into essentially harvesting plots. We can grow both softwood and hardwood for our future use, and enhance the forestation agenda and the CO2 emission agenda. So those are the two kind of the wooden house construction and turning agricultural land into harvesting land are the key things that we're doing, besides kind of reforestation of the forest that we use for our everyday production needs, and all the kind of efficiency programs that we have in our production units to reduce CO2 emission by replacing the old technology with the latest machinery and equipment, that have the CO2 reduction methods in them from the beginning.
Okay, thank you very much, Mikhail. We will come back with a discussion on what can be used to reduce the carbon emissions later in this panel. But I would like to continue first with the regulatory aspect of the climate change. Tatiana already mentioned that Russia is in the process of adoption of its new law on CO2 emissions, while the European Union is due to come up with the long-awaited proposal for its carbon border adjustment mechanism. So Tatiana, can you please talk to us about the implications of these regulations to Russian companies, and what in particular other regulatory decisions do we need to watch for and expect in the coming months?
Yeah, Alexander, this regulation, or better to say, preliminary announcement of European plans to introduce this regulation last year, they served as a wake-up call both for the Russian business and for the Russian regulators, who were far less preoccupied by this agenda before this announcement. It is still not clear how exactly this regulation will be shaped. Couple of weeks ago, there was a leakage of preliminary document, but we still do not know how the final version will look like, which is to be published on July 14th. In the consultations with the representatives of the European Union, it is already clear that oil, gas, coal, so fuels, they will not be part of this regulation, which is a big relief for the Russian authorities, first of all, and for the Russian companies. It is primarily targeted at steel and cement makers, fertilizer producers, so other energy-intensive industries, and basically the assessments of losses which Russian exporters will face due to this regulation turned to be out not as high as people thought just a year ago, but it is only the first step of the European Union, so it's not time to relax and think that, okay, it will not create any significant damage. Basically, European Union made it very clear that it is planning to expand the number of the goods which will be included in this regulation. And obviously, we see already, even during the last year, quite an impressive growth of the ETS price of carbon, which means that this tax will increase with the time. So I think that at the end of the day, most of the Russian companies, not only exporters, but also companies working on the domestic market, in this or another way, will be affected by this regulation. Of course, we are now heading to the beginning of negotiations. So European Union will publish the final version, and then there will be public discussions. There will be a period to submit proposals and different corrections to this regulation, and it seems that Russian business will be engaged in this process, and I hope that finally something more or less balanced will be achieved. But the problem is that solving this short-term threat, short-term problem, anyway, we cannot avoid a longer-term pressure, because we hear already China discussing similar regulation. No idea what will happen in the US, but basically it is obvious that earlier or later this or another way of carbon price for exporters might be introduced, and therefore Russia started also to think about the way how to introduce something similar domestically to avoid this money going to the EU budget, but rather targeting them to the Russian budget. There is an experiment which is under development right now at Sakhalin Island. They are just preparing the regulation, so it's too early to say anything about the details. But the plan is to announce this territory as achieving net zero by 2025 and to start an experiment on carbon trading. So that will be the first attempt. hopefully it will be successful and hopefully it will be accepted by the European side. There are so many uncertainties, but I wouldn't, Alexander, I wouldn't actually focus only on CBM. It is important, it is short-term story and discussion, but there are other types of regulation which is now under discussion in the EU, which could affect Russian companies as well. Strategy on methane emissions. The regulation should be published by the end of this year. We do not know what will be in sight so far, but it will definitely affect oil and gas companies. Then the whole European taxonomy, which defines sustainable projects and unsustainable, and the rules of for the financial sector to invest in these different types of projects. So we are just in the very beginning of this evolution of the external markets, and the only thing we can say for sure that the requests from the importers will become more and more pressuring on the Russian producers in order to decarbonize. This is the only thing that is like granted.
Thank you, Tatiana. Can I continue on the subject of regulation and ask Svetlana to share the experience of Norilsk nickel with Russia's regulatory framework on climate change?
Yeah, sure. To start with, definitely this year was quite high level of activity on the side for regulator in dealing with climate change related agenda, and we actually supported these initiatives. We assess positively the action of Russian regulator related to speeding up of crucially important and long anticipated laws, such as Russian law on greenhouse gases emissions and green taxonomy by National Bank. However, we do consider that further efforts can be taken to foster establishment and launch of Russian carbon trading system and its alignment with the similar system in the European Union, China, USA. Also, more efforts can be allocated towards development of national decarbonization strategy with firm targets and action plans for at least key industries, coupled with some important initiatives on the National Climate Change Adaptation Plan. Namely, corporate sector would benefit from downscaling of IPCC climate change scenarios on Russia and its regions, so we can use it to in our calculation toward TCFD activities. Also, we see great value for domestic businesses from development of socio-economic scenarios for Russia, also compatible with IPCC climate change scenarios, in order to improve corporate response to tackle climate change and properly meet climate change aspects into strategic planning and risk management. The company Nornickel is ready to participate in metal and mining related part of any further consultation in the mentioned areas, and share experience and also insights when it comes to further development of our industry.
Thank you. Thank you, Svetlana. So one of the aspects of regulation, has to do with the growing penetration of recycling technologies. And Peter, you already mentioned recycling is an important part of SIBUR's climate strategy. Is recycling a threat or an opportunity for SIBUR?
Sure, thanks, Alexander. Just as a backdrop, keep in mind that we are operating in growing markets, primarily Russia, Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, with growing demand for our packaging products, and Also keep in mind that our packaging material is less energy intensive over its life cycle than many other options for, say, short-term packaging for food and other products. So we definitely see it as an opportunity to, recycling as an opportunity to grow our business, both through mechanical recycling and undoubtedly, but eventually also chemical recycling. On mechanical recycling, we've already launched our first production project at our polyeth facility in Blagoveshchensk, which is in Bashkiria, where we intend to launch production next year. We've already started to build the facility, launch production next year of our green PET granules. This will contain about 1/4 of recycled material. And we intend to grow this business in sync with recycling practices developing in Russia and the related market for recycled plastic becoming more developed in Russia. In terms of chemical recycling, it's definitely an R&D priority for us and should provide some real options, but probably only within 3 to 5 years. But when we do have those options, they should be more efficient than mechanical recycling, and they will help to further reduce CO2 emissions. So we are prioritizing those, but see those further out.
Thank you. It's interesting you mentioned green PET. You know, it's inevitable that the outcome of the climate change will translate into the emergence of new green products. You know, there's green aluminum already in existence, green oil, green gas, etc. And NOVATEK in particular has started marketing green LNG to its customers. So Mark, can you please share with us the experience that you see for green LNG? What kind of demand growth do you see? How big this business can become for NOVATEK, and how different are the marketing channels for green versus traditional LNG?
Yeah, that's correct, Alexander. But I think before I get onto that specifically, I just want to follow up on the comment Tatiana made in relation to the regulations. I think sometimes it's often overlooked that Russia pipeline gas for the last 50 plus years contributed over 5 trillion cubic meters of natural gas to the European Union, has allowed the European Union to decarbonize and move away from about 46%, coal usage to about 15%. So I think when the regulators start making these decisions, they also ought to look that Russia has been a large contributor to the decarbonization process in EU already and will contribute. And I think that same agenda is also being played out, whether you look at LNG or pipeline gas, et cetera, going into the Asian Pacific market. China is a good example as we move away from coal to natural gas. But yeah, you're right. Green LNG is still developing. If we look at the total trade in the LNG markets, I think green transactions were only about 10. And one of the ones that came out of Russia, Gazprom to Shell, was actually sourced from our Yamal LNG product. So it's a way for us to go in as we control the whole value chain from upstream to liquefaction to shipping, et cetera. We understand the scope 1, scope 2 elements. So we're able to participate in these green tenders that we see in the marketplace. But how we categorize it, I think it's good to look at, we try to look at the hierarchy of green options. Okay, so if you look at that, saying at the lowest level of options, you look at, say, carbon offsets. And that's when somebody goes out, and what you're really asking somebody to do is mitigate your carbon emissions. So you're not doing anything yourself, you're asking somebody else to take that responsibility. And I actually think we're going to start seeing pushbacks from governments that are going to say that is not acceptable as the only solution. So then as you start going up the hierarchy, it becomes much more difficult, because then you have to take a more proactive approach to carbon abatement or carbon mitigation. And like I said earlier, some of the things that we're looking at is on a carbon capture and storage option, where we have gone on, say for Yamal LNG, we have identified subsurfaces that we can work in. We know the number of injection wells, but this is an area when we talk about regulations, is Russia doesn't really have a regulation in place today for carbon injection. So we have to work on that. So we just can't go and do it. We have to make sure that it's in compliance with Russian law. And so we're actually working now, and we hope that by 2022, we can take an FID decision, a final investment decision, to move forward with that type of project. In terms of the size, I mean, one of the things as we go up the hierarchy again, and we get to the very top, the very top of the hierarchy says no more fossil fuels. And as I alluded in my opening comments, we believe that's totally unrealistic, but that is something that the green movement would love to see, and some NGOs, et cetera, want. But again, with the economic development that we see, 2 billion more people coming on the planet Earth by 2050, GDP doubling, the only way you can really get economic prosperity and improve the standard of living of individuals is through the use of energy, more energy, not less energy. So if we look at 2040 as a number, if you want to talk about the size of the market, you know, we're thinking that LNG will double by 2040 to about 700 plus MBTAs on an annual basis. So that could be the size, because our opinion is that all LNG will be green LNG. So that moniker of calling it specifically, where maybe individual customers today are willing to pay a premium, although we're not seeing a lot of that, but they'll be willing to pay a premium, that's going to all go away. And every LNG cargo that being delivered in some form or manner will have to be decarbonized, so nobody will call it green LNG. By controlling the value chain, one of the things that we have the advantage over, say, our US LNG competitors. US LNG competitors, which are basically on a tolling arrangement model, where they buy gas from various sources, they have to go upstream to try to determine whether or not the producer has met the requirement, whether it's fracking, flaring, et cetera, and they have to receive certifications from that element. So one of the most important things that we look at today is this whole concept on monitoring, verifying, reporting. And that's a sticky question today, where we're seeing a lot of companies that are trying to work, and that's part of the reason why, you know, the methane guiding principles group that we talked about, we're working on it, because in the industry today, the biggest leak is not CO2, the biggest leak is methane, and that is something that we can tackle more effectively as an industry rather than carbon. Because if you listen to some of the policy, you know, without carbon, we don't get photosynthesis. Without photosynthesis, we don't get plant life. And so to be able to, you know, say that we want to remove carbon, which is only one element in a multi-complex system of climate, you know, is kind of ludicrous that you can control that. But even, again, one of the things that makes it really interesting too, is that if we look at the carbon question, right, the industry generates about 13% roughly, maybe up to 15% of the carbon. So that means 80 to 85% plus is done on the combustion side. Right? So when we go scope 1, scope 2, it's easy. So to get to the scope 3 level, which we'll report in our upcoming sustainability report in July, you know, you have to work downstream. And that's where, like Peter and everybody was talking about, you know, Norilsk with their power. So you're working with our customers downstream to try to green their processes so that we can also include as part of our, you know, scope 3 requirements. But just give you an example. On a cargo of LNG today, so-called green that's on the market, if like we use ARC7s, 170,000 cubic meters, if we look at an average of $7 to $10 carbon cost per ton, that equates to about $1.5 to $2 million per cargo, right? Or roughly 50 to 80 cents per MMBTU to deliver. So somebody's gonna have to pay it. So the question is, how do we split? Is it going to be 25% that the producer pays, 75% that the consumer pays? And that question still remains to be answered. And I think this, you know, Tatiana, the same question we had a carbon tax. Who's ultimately going to pay for it, right? It's going to, you know, the industry is pushing for the consumer market to absorb a large portion of this process. So I think these are the things that we need to you know, settle first before this question gets solved. But I think in terms of size and scale, everything will be green LNG, and we can look at volumes at least 700 million tons plus by 2040.
Thank you very much, Mark. Mikhail, can I ask you about the market environment for the green paper products and packaging? What are the opportunities there for Segezha Group?
What exactly is the question? Opportunities in what?
In green paper products and packaging. So we spoke about the green products, so the low carbon intensity products. So what is the market situation there?
Well, I mean, the process of producing paper in the modern pulp and paper mills involves burning part of the raw material. Roughly, for 1 ton of pulp, you need about 5 cubic meters of wood, out of which 1 ton or 1 cubic meter is fiber, and 4 cubic meters is organic part of the wood, which is being burned in large so-called recovery boilers, and this energy is used to actually fuel and support the entire pulp mill, and also part of energy is being sold outside. So it's not only satisfying. So it's not only a plant to produce the pulp, but also an electrical plant, if you want. And from that perspective, I don't think that the process of producing paper is going to change in any close future. It will remain the same, and some CO2 emissions will inevitably be generated by producing paper. As far as all the other lines of products that we have, for example, like sawnwood, glulam, CLT production, plywood, and others, they require nothing more than electric energy, and then it's a question of where this electric energy comes from. And in Russia, it could come from hydro power stations, which are kind of CO2 neutral, nuclear power stations, which we have plenty of in Russia, and nuclear is actually one of the ways. As far as I know, actually, the only technology available at this point, we can economically produce energy without generating CO2. So I expect this to be developed further in Russia. But I think the key part is that the raw material that we use, which is wood, is a renewable material, and we have an obligation to regrow pretty much everything then we cut. And what I was talking about before with using the agricultural land for plantation and reforestation, we actually intend to generate a lot more CO2 consumption rather than production. And paper packaging is considered to be kind of a green alternative to other kinds of packaging because of the ease of utilization and less damage to water, which does not immediately transfer into reduction of CO2, but nevertheless contributes to the overall green agenda. About 83% of the forests under our management are so-called FSC certified. It's a special international agency that comes in and checks on the regular basis whether we are operating those forests responsibly, whether we do the reforestation as we have to, what kind of equipment and machinery we use, whether this machinery produces CO2, whether it's new and in good condition, and how the people work, and so on and so forth. So I think kind of overall, Segezha Group, as I said, is CO2 negative, not positive. So we kind of generate or create more of the CO2 consumption capability than production capability. So from that perspective, all of our products can be and are considered to be green products.
Thank you very much, Mikhail. Climate change also brings risks, and Norilsk nickel experienced its first-hand with the recent spill of 20,000 tons of diesel fuel in the Arctic. Svetlana, what conclusions have you drawn from this event, and how can you minimize such risks in the future?
Yes, last year example has demonstrated to us that more efforts is due to be committed toward understanding climate change and risk in the regions of our operation. Definitely deep fundamental and applied research into climate change trends in Arctic need to be done. For that, in 2020, Norilsk established cooperation with 30 scientists from 14 research institutes and conducted Great Norilsk expedition that conducted scientific work on Norilsk region, including distribution and dynamic of cryogenic processes. Norilsk has begun development of satellite permafrost monitoring system to ensure geotechnical safety of buildings and structures in our polar division. The pilot commissioning of the system is scheduled for late 2021, early 2022, and we hope that the system would allow us to early detect possible deformations once it matures. Additionally, company invested in upgrade of diagnostic center of polar division and permafrost laboratory to allow use of new monitoring devices. Well, and I have to reiterate that tackling climate change and devising proper instruments for risk management requires significant investment toward fundamental research of Arctic. And we hope that the company's first steps to devise better instruments for climate-related risk management will be also supported by broader efforts on the country level as well.
Thank you, Svetlana. Can I address a similar question to Mark? NOVATEK has major production facilities in the Arctic. So, Mark, can you talk to us how NOVATEK manages the climate risk?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, we had to answer many questions this past year relating to the Norilsk spill, as you alluded to, and I think it got investors focused more on what companies are doing in the Arctic zone. And so I'd just like to say, we've been operating in the Arctic zone for more than 25 years. All of our core operations are pretty much above the polar circle. And so we take a proactive approach to the, sort of climate risk mitigation. And for example, I could say like at Yamal LNG, we drilled 38,000 individual pilings, and all the facilities are basically above the permafrost that have thermal stabilizers there. And we monitor that on real-time basis with our office, our scientific research center in Tumen, who relays it back and forth between the operational people in Yamal at Segezha. So we can actually see any changes in movement and in temperature, and then make the appropriate adjustments based on these thermal stabilizers. The other thing that we've done too, that I think is very important, is that at the planning stage, it's almost like the concept of design by green, if you understand. I mean, from the very beginning, and I think this is where the changes as these debates go on are going to impact future projects, because the people are going to have to take into consideration this whole concept of the green movement into the design process. So when we were building Yamal, one of the things we did, we looked at permafrost sensitivity analysis through the engineering process, and we looked at changes in ambient temperatures of 2 to 4 degrees. We looked at soil temperature changes of 1 to 2 degrees Celsius, and we stress test these numbers to see if it had any movement or possibility to potential risk for us. And based on the stress analysis and the temperature climate that we've seen over a relatively long period of time, we felt that we can withstand any of these temperature changes given the way that the plan has been designed. Going to our next project, because as we're moving into Arctic LNG 2, we decided to deploy a whole different concept. I mean, so what we decided from Yamal, which was built onshore, to the Arctic LNG 2 project, which is built on these gravity-based structures, which are the self-contained, LNG units at 6.6 million tons per annum. And these units will be moored in the Ob River, and they're built to not be on the permafrost. So by moving it into the Ob River, we essentially only have essential operations, field development, some administrative building, the new airport landing strip that we just launched last week up there. And so what this has done, Alexander, this reduced the environmental footprint on a per unit basis about a quarter of the size. So each GBS, which is a fully contained 6.6 million ton unit, represents a quarter of what it would have been built if we did it onshore. And so that's some of the things that we've done to mitigate risk. And then I think finally, I like to say, is all our equipment is brand new. I mean, one of the things about NOVATEK that distinguishes from the privatization process, we didn't acquire anything from the old Soviet legacy assets. So everything was built brand new with new technologies, et cetera. And I think that helps us in implementing the latest technologies that you can deploy given the period of time where we're developing. So I think that's also a benefit from us, is not the inherence of old Soviet legacy equipment.
Thank you very much, Mark. We have probably around 10 minutes left for the discussion. And so I want to spend it talking to maybe some of you about the carbon reduction strategies that could be used in Russia. And can I please start with SIBUR? SIBUR already leads many of its peers on the metrics of carbon emission intensity, but I know that the company has plans to improve further. So Peter, can you please talk to us about the opportunities for carbon reduction that you see in SIBUR?
Sure, Alexander. At the risk of maybe repeating myself, because I mentioned a few of them at the beginning, but happy to proceed. I think first, it's fair to say we're exploring all options and their viability, both in the near term, having an immediate or soon to be impact, and of course, longer term potential opportunities and technologies. But if we start with the near term, the priorities are, as I mentioned, reduction of emissions at existing facilities, some of which, like Mark just mentioned, are quite new. So that's new capacities with new technologies and better monitoring systems, and making real investments when it comes to emissions, both air and water or waste. Secondly, further deployment of green electricity, solar power, and hydro supply, also possibly for our Amur gas chemical complex, or other projects that can be supplied through the grid efficiently via hydro. Another is the forest projects, forestation-related projects that I mentioned, the two that we have in Tyumen and Voronezh. And again, those are pretty early stage, but we're encouraged by the level of enthusiasm of regional governments in exploring this and developing the ability to understand what these projects can actually contribute and how to monitor them, measure them, and eventually contribute them into the regulation discussion that's happening. And then last, carbon capture opportunities at our existing sites. Again, I just want to mention that we are a growing company with growing demand for our products in our main markets, Asia and Russia. And if we think longer term, and we think about our more broadly ESG strategy, which was approved last year, we are thinking about carbon reduction and what type of, and I go back to one of Mark's comments at the beginning of this call, not necessarily promising something that's fairly vague in 2050, or seems like not detailed enough, if you will, supported by details. We are thinking about updating our own strategy. We will be announcing an update to our strategy before the end of this year. And one of the things we're really trying to get to is finding a path to carbon neutral growth for SIBUR.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. As we're drawing to the end of this discussion, I just wanted to ask Mark one more question. NOVATEK recently announced quite a large number of cooperation agreements on decarbonization with Severstal, Total Energies, Siemens, Baker Hughes. So what, can you just talk briefly what those agreements mean for NOVATEK and what carbon reduction opportunities you see there for the company?
I think it's in line with what we've been discussing throughout the session today. It's they're at still very early stages of study, but like I mentioned, the carbon capture project with Yamal, with Baker Hughes and Siemens. We're looking at the fuel mix project, a hydrogen fuel mix for turbines and compressors, which will allow us to reduce our carbon footprint. We made the announcement with Fordham. It's like, Peter just mentioned, buying cleaner energy from the grid. And so if we can introduce, into this a scope 2 by demonstrating that we can buy, solar or wind power energy, it reduces our carbon footprint. Continue introducing, solar panels on the, domestic, infill pipeline structures that we already use, but just extend that. Possibly look at small scale wind farm up in Yamal, to power some of our own operations. What we've done already in terms of, one of the announcements we made recently was a move away from Obsky LNG to Obsky gas chemistry, which will be then a plant that produces clean fuels like ammonia, hydrogen, and methanol. We also talk about one of the things we're working on is the ships, going through the Northern Sea route. By just going through the Northern Sea route, we reduce our distance, like I said, by 40%, and that reduces our carbon footprint. And I think the other thing that I think sometimes people miss about NOVATEK is, we have large, medium, and small scale LNG. And one of the things that I want to just mention on the small scale LNG is we're working to build out a network of fueling stations inside of Russia and in the EU that basically transfers the heavy trucks and modal transportation to LNG or compressed natural gas. And so we've already built out a system where we're going to connect the northwest Russia through the Urals mountain with this plant that we built in Magnitogorsk, as well as by the end of this year, I think we'll be the largest supplier of carbon neutral, sort of LNG gas in Germany as part of the refueling process. So we're taking these small steps. I know they're incremental, but this is what we're talking about in terms of decarbonization. It has to take, you can't have these big grandiose plans. You have to take these small concrete steps, and that will lead and that will build onto one another, and that will help us reduce our carbon footprint. So that's some of the things that we're doing, Alexander.
Thank you very much, Mark. So we already spent slightly more than 1 hour discussing a variety of aspects related to climate change, including regulation, technologies, climate risk, and product innovation. As we come to an end of this panel discussion, I want to address my final question to Tatiana and Mitrova. Where do you see the biggest challenge for Russia in the area of climate change, and how long do you think it will take to transform the Russian economy to fit into the low carbon world?
Thank you, Alexander. There are always challenges and opportunities. And in this particular case, I think that Russia has actually more opportunities rather than challenges in this situation of global green transition and how to fit into this global green transition. The only really big challenge is that regulators might be too slow to create a proper framework domestically to support the attempts of the business to decarbonize. You saw today that basically in different industries, large business is already going ahead, is already developing different decarbonization projects. But as Mark mentioned, for example, on CCUS, it cannot be implemented without proper regulation. The same on reforestation, on renewables, and so on. So the lack of proper regulatory framework, this is the major danger, both domestically and internationally, because the second big problem which could occur, I hope it won't, is the compatibility of Russian regulation with the EU or Chinese or US regulations, so that, for example, Russian green certificates would be accepted by the Europeans. offsets which are produced domestically are accepted by the importers and so on. So this compatibility of different regulatory frameworks, it will require endless dialogue between Russian regulators and foreign regulators, which is sometimes difficult due to the geopolitical reasons. But I hope that in this desire to combat climate change, they will find a common language. At the same time, as I've mentioned, there are numerous opportunities. Actually, Russia is very well positioned, historically, geographically, blessed by God with all these resources to be a very important player in green transformation. It is #1 in wind and solar potential in the world. Surprise, surprise, but it's the fact. It has enormous potential on carbon capture and storage. Yeah, all these depleted oil and gas fields, they could really store huge amounts of carbon. It has fantastic opportunities for reforestation and other natural sinks management. And actually, probably the biggest and the lowest hanging fruit, which was not actually discussed today, it is energy efficiency. So we are among the most energy intensive countries in the world, and with minimal efforts, with really very short term and small investments, Russia could reduce its energy intensity and its carbon intensity by 30%, which is a lot. Methane emissions reduction, which is again, it is just a good housekeeping, as Mark mentioned. It's not a rocket science. It could also allow for very fast and significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions domestically. And I would completely echo what Mark was saying about decarbonization of oil and gas, green oil, green gas. This is the trend where Russia could become a trendsetter. It has already, most of the Russian oil and gas companies have much lower carbon footprint than their international peers. And with quite cheap, minimal efforts, they can become the world leaders. So I would agree that there is plenty of the global demand for energy will be growing, and there is definitely a room for decarbonized molecules, decarbonized gases, low carbon or completely decarbonized oil. And I think Russia could really take a significant part of this niche. So all in all, I would say it seems to be quite positive, and the most positive part is what we've heard today, the activities that companies are doing in their everyday routine already. It's not just something aside to demonstrate to the investors, it's really becoming everyday life and everyday effort. So I'll stop on that.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. I think that's a great point on which to finish this panel discussion. There's more opportunities than challenges for Russia and for the Russian oil companies. All that is left for me to do is to thank our audience for listening to this panel discussion, and to thank the participants for the available remarks. Tatiana, Svetlana, Mark, Peter, and Mikhail, thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you, Alexander. Bye-bye.
Knowledge is information, but not all information turns into knowledge. Today, every company leaves digital footprints in hundreds of different sources. But this information by itself does not tell you who it is you're looking at and what the risks of doing business with them are. Businesses can't exist in a vacuum. They need employees, customers, partners, contractors, investors. Good counteragents help a company succeed, create products, make profit, expand business opportunities. But what about bad ones? 49% of organizations around the world say that they've been victims of fraud or economic crime. 2/3 of Russian companies say they've encountered economic crime in the past 2 years. This is significantly higher than the global average. Every year, 15% of companies simply disappear, whether on their own initiative or because they're forced to do so by tax bodies, often leaving unpaid debts. If you want to minimize your risk, you need to find and analyze every scrap of information you can, identifying, analyzing, collecting facts. Processing big data is impossible without qualified specialists, experience, time, expensive equipment, new technology, machine learning, graphs. Spark Interfax gathers information from all available sources and converts it into knowledge, allowing you to see the world of business in its entirety with all its risks and opportunities. And there's no doubt that tomorrow we'll be able to understand the world of business even better, thanks to the emerging digital economy, cutting-edge technology, and the availability of new information about the lives of companies. Knowledge decreases risks and creates trust, the foundation of any successful business.